The winter energy crisis won't be as bad as everybody fears. Inflation will start to come down. By the spring, that enormous Labour poll lead will be a fading memory. And as the next election approaches, ordinary people across the land will throw their caps in the air and cheer the name of good Queen Liz. No, I can't do it. Tempting as it is to tilt against the conventional wisdom, sometimes you just have to face facts. The conference was awful. The speech was awful. This has been the worst start to any premiership, I think, in recent history, perhaps even in all British history. That, Dominic Sambrook, was a top pundit, a top columnist, a top historian, namely yourself, delivering your verdict on Liz Truss. What was that, about a couple of weeks ago?
Yes, it was. So halfway through her premiership.
Yeah.
Yes.
So now it's come to pass. So we're recording this at 13:40, so 10 minutes after Liz Truss announced her resignation. And clearly people across the land will not be throwing their caps in the air and cheering the name of good Queen Liz. And would you, I guess nothing has happened since you wrote that to change your opinion that she ranks as perhaps the worst. I mean, seriously, do you think she's the worst prime minister of all time?
Well, I'll tell you what I wrote. I wrote later on in that article. I think she's comfortably, putting aside her politics, I said, I think she's comfortably the least impressive person to become prime minister in my lifetime since the advent of universal suffrage, and perhaps even since the creation of the office under George I. And actually, I think as a columnist, you spend an awful lot of time making historical parallels and getting things wrong, making predictions
and engaging in hyperbole as well, right?
Yes.
I mean, the worst, the best, whatever.
Yes, but making predictions that turn out to be ludicrously untrue. However, in this case, I think it was pretty obvious to anybody who, without a stake in the contest, as it were, that Liz Truss was a fantastically underpowered candidate for the Tory leadership. She won all the same. There was nothing in her premiership that suggested any sort of hitherto concealed qualities.
It seems to me to have been one last massive gesture of irresponsibility and spite from the preceding prime minister, who politically was much more aligned with Sunak. I mean, Sunak was continuity Boris, but because Johnson resented what Sunak had done to him, he was determined to spike his guns no matter what he could. And so he backed Truss, presumably knowing she'd be terrible.
But that's what people say, isn't it? Does he?
Putting his kind of personal resentment above the national good.
Yes, I mean, that's what some people say, that Boris Johnson, I mean, it seems unbelievable to me, Tom, that if just a few months ago, you and I were recording another emergency podcast, or we recorded, I think, 2 emergency podcasts on the fall of Boris Johnson. Once when he had a confidence vote, which he narrowly survived, and then once when he had that absolutely preposterous series of events in Number 10 where everybody resigned, but he refused to leave.
Yeah.
Now, at that stage, I can remember we did this podcast and you said to me, is there any precedent for this in British political history? And the answer was no. And I said to you at the time, I don't think, I never imagined I would see scenes of this sort of utter ridiculousness in Number 10.
Yeah. Well,
and yet they have been eclipsed by yesterday's laughable, so for our overseas listeners, a laughable shambles in Westminster. I mean, when the ITV Evening News reported on it, and the sort of the very neutral, sober kind of news presenter, Tom Bradbury, said, it is total and utter abject chaos. And that was his introduction to the main news bulletin. That gave you some sense of the flavour. You had government whips effing and blinding, storming out. Truss apparently pursuing her chief whip around the Palace of Westminster, begging her to stay.
Home Secretary forced to resign, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, but Dominic, we're not a politics podcast, because I gather that there is another politics. There's another podcast in the Goldhanger stable that may well be handling this. So I thought that since we are history focused, there might be 2 areas to focus on. One is parallels in British history, short-lived prime ministers, short term. Are there other parallels in other periods, other countries that we could compare this to? And then the other question that I would like to ask you is that you are a historian of modern Britain. You've written this series of brilliant analyses of British political, but also social and cultural life from 1955, is it?
Yeah,
1956,
exactly. Yeah.
Up to 1982. And one of the running themes in your books is that most people do not pay much attention to what is going on in
Yes.
Downing Street. So they're busy whipping up Angel Delight or playing on space hoppers or watching the football or whatever.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you, does all this matter, or is it just surface froth? But first of all, short-lived prime ministers. So Liz Truss, by the conventional reckoning, has now beaten George Canning.
Yes, she has beaten George Canning.
George Canning, who we last mentioned accompanying Horatio Nelson.
Oh, God, yes.
To HMS Victory in Portsmouth in 1805, shortly before he sails off to go and die at the Battle of Trafalgar. So that's the measure of, just what a long-running record that's been. There is some controversy, isn't there, about whether the Earl of Bath should actually hold the honour. So he was asked in 1746 to form a ministry. And he went away and 2 days later came back and said he couldn't. So by that reckoning, he would still hold the record.
Yes, most sources don't rank him as a prime minister. He's not in any of the official lists. I think asking somebody to be a prime minister and then them coming back 2 days later and saying, I can't be, that seems to me frankly, a far more dignified way of proceeding than somebody becoming prime minister and then 45 days later saying, I can't, everybody hates me and I'm terrible. I have to go.
I mean, Dominic, just on the human level, it's the worst nightmare, isn't it? Applying for the job for which you're not ultimately qualified. You get it. And then your inability to hold this job that you've wanted all your life is on the most humiliating public stage.
Tom, I wrote a column about this earlier this week in relation to Kwasi Kwarteng, Truss's short-lived chancellor, about nightmares. And I said, because I wrote I'd had a nightmare about being pursued by Kwasi Kwarteng and then about having to enter a poetry competition against him. So I had two successive nightmares about Kwasi.
So this is when you had flu, wasn't it?
Well, I had flu.
Yeah, we should explain. You don't normally have such weird nightmares. Yeah.
So I had two, I wrote the piece, and it was all about politicians and the sort of the nightmare that we all have of being found out, sort of imposter syndrome. And I do think that with Truss, that actually never before in British history has there been such a spectacular case of somebody getting a job for which they are utterly unqualified and then imploding so dramatically in front of the cameras. I mean, the moment when she was, she was completely humiliated. Kwarteng, her chancellor and sort of partner in crime, had to go. She got rid of him. In came Jeremy Hunt, sort of Mr. Sensible, to be her chancellor and to rip up her policy in front of her. And I remember seeing her sitting on the front bench of the House of Commons alongside Hunt, and she looked like, people sort of said she's on 20-minute day release from Madame Tussauds. She looked like somebody in shock. The colour drained from her cheeks. And there is, at a human level, personally, I don't have a tremendous amount of sympathy with Liz Truss. No one forced her to go for the premiership. But you're right. It must be, it's a bit like the podcast we did about Nixon and Watergate. To see your career unravel in such a humiliating way in public, your inadequacies, we all fear we've got them, and we all know our own limitations, but to have them laid bare and so extensively in front of an audience of tens of millions, that must be awful.
Also, the thing with Kwarteng is that they're very good friends. Whether they still are, I don't know, but they were absolutely, they wrote the budget, which helped precipitate this meltdown together. And the figure of a supposedly powerful office holder obliged to defenestrate a favourite. It's, it kind of redolent of medieval or early modern history. The king's favourites being, so it's a bit like, faint echoes perhaps of Charles I being.
And the Earl of Strafford. So Kwasi Kwarteng is the Earl of Strafford.
Yes, or Edward II. Edward II being forced to get rid of, his favourites or whatever.
Henry VIII, after he got rid of Thomas Cromwell, years afterwards, he would basically sort of say, if only Cromwell was here, he would know how to handle this.
Yes, but Henry VIII, nobody ever forced Henry VIII to do anything. I mean, he was...
No, that's right.
Whereas the thing about Charles I and Edward II are humiliated. And they're broken reeds after that. I mean, it's one of the things that actually leads Charles to fight the Civil War. But someone like Edward II, after he is forced to get rid of his favourites, his authority gets shredded and shredded and shredded.
Yeah, and that's certainly the case for Truss.
I mean, and if Liz Truss is feeling bad, I mean, she can always reflect on the fate of Edward II and think that it might be worse.
Yes, I suppose so. I suppose so. Well, anyway, Tom, to return to your question you asked me, which is about precedents. So we were talking about George Canning. Canning's excuse for being a very short-lived prime minister is he was 119 days, is that he had TB.
Yeah, that's fair enough, isn't it?
You know, most very, very short-lived prime ministers, I'm looking at the list here. So Bonar Law, for example, who was the 20th century's shortest-lived prime minister, Andrew Bonar Law, so that's the 1920s. He came and went in 1922, but he had throat cancer, and he had a fairly distinguished record as the leader of the Tory party for many years before that, and he'd been involved in the coalition government in the Great War and so on. So Truss is really out on her own. Since the dawn of universal suffrage, there has never been a case where somebody has become prime minister through an internal kind of party leadership election and then disappeared within such a short period of time.
And it's been accelerating, hasn't it, the pace at which prime ministers come and go?
Yeah.
But somebody had tweeted that they have a 4-month-old baby who has witnessed three prime ministers, probably, 2 monarchs, about 20 chancellors of the exchequer, about 50 home secretaries. I mean, the churn and the pace is something that we as a nation are not used to.
No, and a good example of that, Tom, is our producer was just saying that Tony, that until the age of 38, I think he'd only ever seen 3 prime ministers. And in my case, from the moment let me get this right, from the autumn after I entered school until I think my 16th birthday, just after my 16th birthday, I'd only ever known 1 prime minister, and that was Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she was there so long. And then, of course, John Major was there for 7 years. Tony Blair was then in for another, a decade or so.
Yeah.
So, it's very unusual in British.
Yeah, so things are speeding up. And the parallel that leaps out at me is the 3rd century in the Roman Empire, right, where you have these long reigns in the 2nd century, Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius and so on, and then it all implodes in the 3rd century. And the obvious comparison to Liz Truss is Gordian I.
That's not a comparison I've often heard from the nation's pundits.
So there's this terrifying figure up in the Balkans, Maximinus Thrax, the Thracian, who's murdered the legitimate an emperor who is kind of related by adoption and so on to Marcus Aurelius. So in that sense, a kind of link with the golden age of the Antonines. And Maximinus Thrax is about 9 foot. He kind of pulls the heads off oxen for fun. He's said to have worn his wife's bangles as rings on his enormous fingers. So he's a kind of terrifying guy. And people back in Rome, think we don't want this barbarian as our emperor. And so they appeal to a very, very distinguished senator called Gordian, who I think he's about 80. And they say, go on. And he really doesn't want to do it, but he feels it's his duty. He's governing Africa, so he's in Carthage. And he's so old, he's kind of Biden-esque, that he says, I can't manage this without my son. So his son who's also called Gordian. So Gordian I, Gordian II, they're kind of co-emperors. And they last 22 days. Oh. And that's it.
Someone kill them?
Yeah, Gordian II loses a battle outside Carthage. He gets killed in the battle. His body's never found. The news is brought to Gordian I. So rather than hold a press conference and announce his resignation, he hangs himself.
Oh my word! That's a strong reaction.
So again, I'm just it's kind of one of the constellations of history, I guess.
Yeah,
it's that no matter how bad things may seem for you,
you're not Gordian I.
There are always people who've had it worse. So I'm just offering that to supporters of Liz Truss that, it could be worse.
Liz Truss will not. There won't be many candidates, Tom, for Liz Truss's resignation honours list. So if you get in now with your consolation,
yes, that'd be good.
I'd say you've got a pretty good chance, actually.
I'm putting that on the record. Of course, the other parallel is one that we have touched on. Was in our series on Australian prime ministers. And there was a stage where basically prime ministers in Australia were knifing each other kind of every other week, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. And yes, and we were talking about that culture of leadership spills. I mean, that was really, because there's actually nothing really wrong with Australia, I would say. I mean, it's not that Australia doesn't have issues and challenges. Of course it does. But I don't think if you were looking for a country where that's political culture had gone wrong, Australia would not be high on that list.
No.
And there it became a sort of culture of backstabbing, didn't it? And of sort of ludicrous plotting.
Well, because, yes, someone would be stabbed, then they come back from the dead and stab the person who stabbed them, and so it would go on.
So it was actually an argument for the return of death as a weapon in political
Again, that's the lesson of the 3rd century AD. Yeah. Right. Any other parallels that leap to mind? I suppose Italy. There's the cover of The Economist has Britannia holding her trident, and it's got spaghetti wrapped around it.
Italian readers must find that very flattering. But there you had prime ministers, in Italy or in sort of France between the wars, you would have prime ministers rising and falling and disappearing within weeks or days. The difference there, I think, is that, first of all, prime ministers would fall because the nature of that political system meant that politics was a constantly shifting exercise in coalition building. So as different factions fell from office.
And so that has always been the people in favour of the first past the post system that we have in Britain. It's always that you don't need these kind of messy compromises with the risks of coalitions fragmenting that you get in systems under proportional representation. But I suppose the comeback to that is that even in the parliamentary system like we have, both parties are coalitions.
They are. But the reason we've had so much turmoil is not just that the Conservative Party is a very large coalition. It's that, I think it's the result of a couple of things.
Okay. Hold on, Dominic. Hold on.
Oh, because cliffhanger.
So it's just a very kind of short guerrilla episode. And I think we've done enough for the first half. When we come back, though, I want to return to that question I said to you, which was, does any of this matter? Is it just surface froth, or is it expressive of some deeper underlying structural, constitutional, economic malaise? We will find out.
I'm just going to say this to you, that after the break will be your only opportunity in the history of this podcast to do an impersonation of Liz Truss. So whether or not Tom Holland takes that opportunity, we will discover in just a minute or two.
Hello, welcome back to The Rest of History, a special episode that we're putting out following the defenestration of yet another British Prime Minister, in this case, Liz Truss. And before the break, Dominic, you issued a challenge that I should do an impression of Liz Truss, which I'm going to turn down for the reason that I've been away so much over the past few weeks.
You have never heard her speak.
So all summer, I was flat out with my book, which I may have mentioned. Then I went away on holiday to decompress. And as part of that decompression, I was not listening to the news and I was not keeping up with it. And so I kind of came back and I missed all the Liz Truss drama. Then I was away again over the past few days. So basically, I don't really know what she sounds like. So that's the problem. She's got a kind of flat voice, hasn't she?
Very, very flat voice. The only thing I can really imagine her saying is that awful speech, incomprehensibly bad. Next week, I'll be in Beijing, opening up new pork markets.
Yes.
We import more than half of all of our cheese. That is a disgrace.
Well, that's very good. I feel that Liz Truss is at the other end of the Zoom call.
That's terrifying. That's a sentence you never want to hear, Tom.
No, but well, unless she's offering me a peerage.
That peerage for your Gordian-themed consolation.
Yeah, exactly. In which case, I'd love it. But let's get back to the question of is this, so as a historian of modern Britain, is this a typical crisis? Is this the kind of surface churn? Or is this you said that she's the worst prime minister that you can think of. Is this the worst crisis?
No, it's not the worst crisis. I think it's bad, but it's not the worst crisis.
So what's the worst crisis?
Well, I suppose you would have to. I mean, it's a boring and cliched answer, but you'd have to say the summer of 1940 is the worst crisis. I mean, that's an existential crisis.
Post-war. So
post-war, it's really bad. Yeah.
What I mean, I'm not saying, 1588 or whatever. The period that you covered. So from the late 50s through to the present day.
It's a brilliant question, Tom, because actually it depends it cuts to the heart of how you think about politics. Do you think politics is the driver of national life and of historical change and so on? Or do you think politics is the reflection of it?
And you're more the latter, aren't you?
I'm more the latter, yeah. And the crises, when I think about the 1970s, for example, I mean, there were some horrendous crises in the 1970s. I guess the two really classic ones are the winter of 73, 74, with the 3-day week, all these states of emergency and the implosion of Ted Heath's premiership after the oil crisis. Then I suppose the winter of discontent, 78, 79, when James Callaghan's prime ministership, pretty much collapsed because of a colossal breakdown of the relationship between the government and the trade unions and massive strikes. And then you've got the various there was a generalized sense of crisis under Margaret Thatcher the first couple of years, with unemployment going through the roof and so on. In those cases, what was happening at Westminster was very clearly a reflection of bigger economic issues. So it wasn't that politics itself was broken. Politics itself, you could argue, was actually fine, but politicians were just struggling to deal with insuperable, it appeared insuperable problems, and they were broken by them. In this case, I think seems to be something peculiarly rotten with politics. Part of that, by the way, is I think they have the opening up the choice to party activists.
It's terrible.
It was a terrible mistake. So
Liz Truss is basically the Jeremy Corbyn of the Tories.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly what I'd say. I would say that the Labour Party started doing that. It was driven by the left of the Labour Party in the 1980s, Tony Benn. It was his great campaign. He claimed it would open up party democracy, allow ordinary members to choose the leader instead of a handful of MPs. And the Tories felt they had to follow suit in the 1990s. William Hague changed the rules. So since then, the activists and of course what that went hand in hand with is the collapse of both parties as proper mass membership organisations.
Although Jeremy Corbyn supporters would argue that, and correctly, that he was born to the leadership on a great wave of enthusiasm, and actually the party membership under Labour
went up, but that's a different kind of party membership from the days in which Labour was a genuinely, in inverted commas, national party. So in other words,
like a kind of bubo under the armpit, right? A sudden swelling.
Well, what happened under Jeremy Corbyn was that basically people who had very marked left-wing principles rushed into the Labour Party to join it, and therefore swung the centre of gravity massively to the left. But the Labour Party originally, when it was in the first years of the 20th century, was actually in some ways not actually an immensely left-wing party. There were tons and tons of working class members who would never have perceived themselves as being left-wing. So they might have used the language of socialism, but they were still, for example, very patriotic, very small c conservative, in their. That's not the case with the sort of Corbyn membership.
Well, we've talked about this a lot. I mean, the Labour Party all parties are coalitions, and the Labour Party has always been basically a coalition between working class labourers, so hence the name.
Yes.
And as Orwell would put it, your favourite quote,
yes,
the prune juice drinking sandal wearers.
Yes. And
Corbyn's election was the triumph of the prune juice drinkers
of the latter, yeah.
Over everyone. But like similarly, the Tories. I mean, there's an inherent tension within the very name. I mean, then the Conservative Party
Yeah.
that they're not actually very keen on conserving things. So the tension is between, do you uphold the kind of the traditional, I don't know, all the traditional stuff that conservatives are into, or do you adopt a kind of radical libertarian process, which is what Truss wanted to do,
Yes.
which basically involves kind of, destroying all environmental controls and trashing everything you can in the cause of boosting GDP.
Tom, that peerage is vanishing.
Yeah. In both cases, there is a kind of very motivated, ideologically coherent minority within both parties. And it does seem that in both cases, if they seize control of the entire party, it always seems to end in tears.
Of course it does, because they're, by definition, they're not representative, not merely of the mass of the British public. They're not even representative of their own voters, of their own mass of the, let's say, 13 million people who they need to vote for them at the next election.
Well, or indeed MPs.
Or MPs, or even their MPs.
But the Burkean argument for allowing MPs rather than party activists to vote for leaders is that MPs are the voice of the constituents who elect them.
Yeah, well, this is also, by the way, it was also Michael Foot's argument. So Michael Foot, the left-wing Labour Party leader of the 1980s.
Love Michael Foot.
He used to sort of say to the Bennites, we're not just delegates. We're not just waiting to be told we have come here. Michael Foot was a great admirer of Edmund Burke. He said, we have come here to use our judgment, and you should trust MPs to choose the leader that they want. Now, that's deeply embedded in the British parliamentary system, but the reforms of the 1980s and 1990s handed power to small groups of activists who basically chose leaders that the MPs did not want.
And who, by definition, are unrepresentative of the vast mass of the British people, most of whom do not care particularly about politics. So to come back to that question, is this only of interest to people who watch Newsnight, or does it actually matter and does it impact?
Well, it matters, I think, for two reasons. One, it's it's a reflection of the enormous hole that Britain got itself into. Not so much with Brexit. I know we will have listeners who are on both sides of the Brexit issue, so I don't think it's Brexit per se, but I think it's Brexit without a plan. I think that was the real turning point. So it's not necessarily, I think, leaving the European Union. I voted Remain, by the way, in case people are thinking, well, I'm sure people who with very strong views will think we're terribly biased one way or the other anyway. But I don't think that was the issue so much as with an absolute absence of strategy or a strategic vision about where exactly Britain would go. So you would hear completely different things from different Leave campaigners. And what that meant is that as soon as the referendum sort of passed, there was a constant uncertainty and a factional civil war about exactly what to do next. And the Truss...
Well, but Dominic, just slightly play devil's advocate on that. Haven't there in fact been two plans? There have always been two plans about what to do with Brexit. And one is a kind of red Tory levelling up, cut immigration, all that kind of stuff. And the other one is Singapore on the Thames, rip up the rule book, pump sewage if it boosts GDP, all that kind of thing. And basically the first one didn't work with Boris. And so they thought, let's try the other one. That might work. And they've tried it with Liz Truss, and that hasn't worked either. Well,
I think that's effectively what has happened. But that said, Tom, I don't think people thought it through as clearly as actually you've suggested. I don't think people did think, well, that hasn't worked. I think it became all messed up with personality politics and kind of court politics.
Then also, to be fair to the government, there's also...
they've got a horrible inheritance. Yeah.
COVID and then Ukraine. So
COVID and Ukraine, of course, that's torpedoed everything.
So it's impossible for any minister to go on the radio and not say, well, it's a global crisis. Actually, Liz Truss, when she resigned, she got Putin, I think, in after about 10 seconds, didn't she?
She did. It was in a sentence too, I think.
Yeah.
And she's not wrong. It is a global crisis.
But we've handled it worse. Would you say that's fair?
At a purely sort of high political level, we've certainly handled it worse. It's easy to forget that, for example, our COVID furlough scheme was probably the most generous in Europe. Our vaccine rollout was very fast. We have actually come up with the weapons and stuff for Ukraine. So and there are some things that we've done well. But in terms of the personalities of our politicians, the way they've presented themselves, their standards of behaviour and of decency and so on, and just sort of dignity, you're absolutely right. They have disgraced themselves to a degree unmatched anywhere else in Europe. And it does pain me to say that, because Tom,
you are a patriot,
that nobody loves to bash our continental neighbours as much as I do, and to big up Britain. But it's true, last night.
But in a way, we are bigging up Britain. We're saying our crisis is the worst.
Well,
if we can't be the best, let's be the worst.
I mean, I think we should. I expect a robustous democracy. I do not want a sort of European Parliament style. Children are doing interpretive dance in the aisles.
Yes, so we said this. We said this about in the previous episode we did on the resignation of Johnson. We did say that. But there's rumbustious, and then there's
ludicrous.
I mean, a bloodstained shambles.
Yes, and I think that element about shambles. So to go back to your point about does it matter to ordinary people? It obviously matters enormously if it's going to put 2 percentage points on the interest rate that you pay for your mortgage. And this is the real thing with the Truss fiasco, is that it's not just that we had an absolutely ludicrously ill-equipped person as prime minister for 45 days or whatever. It's that the implosion of her ridiculous economic plan, ill-conceived economic plan, has meant that the Bank of England will probably end up raising interest rates a percentage point or two higher than they might otherwise have done. And for some families, that will be economically catastrophic.
And businesses.
Exactly. So that, it's easy for us to sort of chuckle and to, draw our comparisons. And it's easy for political correspondents, of course, to get very excited about all the hullabaloo and the sort of hurly-burly. But it's important to remember these economic figures really matter to people. So yes, I think it does matter. What I really hope it doesn't do is it lead to a sort of long-term 70s style culture of sort of negativity and all that, that basically not just here, but among people. Do they invest in Britain? Is Britain a bit of a dead duck? All that kind of thing.
But reading your books on the 70s, the sense of crisis there seemed to be that the massive indicators in the economy, so inflation, unemployment, growth, were consistently against the government. It didn't matter whether it was Tory or Labour. It was a kind of a disaster. And perhaps in a similar way, that was bred of foreign circumstances and national incompetence.
Yes.
And do you think that we're back in a kind of similar bind to that? Is this a return to the 70s, as people say, or
to some extent,
worse?
yeah.
Is it worse or is it better?
Oh, is it worse or is it better?
Because I suppose one of the things in the 70s is that you had North Sea oil starting to come on.
You did come in, so that's a boon.
And I guess the demographics were also more positive. If Britain was a younger nation then.
Yes, but on the counter argument to that, Tom, I suppose would be that you're stepping right back. The real problem for Britain in the 70s was that it was about to embark on a long delayed and very painful period of economic transition, which you could argue in the really long run is the transition from basically the Victorian or the immediately post-Victorian economy to the economy we have now. And that was going to have to come. It was going to be so difficult. It was going to involve a lot of lost jobs, a lot of damage to communities and so on. And that was the problem that lay under everything else. Failing industries, steel, coal, shipbuilding, all these kinds of things. These things that were clearly just going to go. And so when people looked at Britain from outside, they kind of said it's an old country and one that is desperately, desperately crying out for modernization. Britain undoubtedly has issues and challenges right now, as so many countries do, but I don't think it's an outlier, perhaps, in quite the same way. I suppose what some listeners would probably say, wouldn't they, is that they think Brexit represents a different kind of existential challenge.
Yeah, maybe. But I think looking at it in the international context, and I think back to the episodes on oil that we did with Helen Thompson.
Yes.
Where she talked about how essentially the moment that the global economy became centered on oil rather than on coal, this was a problem, not just for Britain, but for the whole of Europe, that essentially it is more expensive for Europeans to make things because our energy is more expensive than it was for Russia or for the United States. And we're definitely back in that situation now. Is there a risk not just for Britain, but for the whole of Europe, that we're going to go through a process of deindustrialization bred by the brute fact that we have less cheap energy than, say, the Americans do?
Crikey, Tom, I thought I'd come here to, exchange a few cheap quips about Liz Truss. And yes, I suppose in the long run, that is the fear, isn't it? That there's a further period of, is it deindustrialization? I don't know, a further period of economic transition to come in which Europe will be even more, Western Europe will be even more be on the receiving end of globalization, as it were, than it was in the 1970s and 1980s. And that, yes, communities in Britain, which have perhaps become very dependent on foreign investment or on, cheap manufacturing abroad or whatever it might be, are going to, face some pretty tough winters with energy becoming more expensive and with this sort of period of change. Then are you going to see prime ministers rising and falling more and more quickly in your 3rd century Rome style?
Yes, exactly. And perhaps not just in Britain, that crises may start to manifest themselves in other European countries as well.
Well, I mean, the United States might be a good parallel here. You saw,
but the United States is in a good position because it's energy rich.
It is.
Its energy is cheap. Ours is prohibitively expensive.
But the politics of grievance and resentment has become much more marked today in America than it was in, let us say, the 1980s and 1990s. So in other words, there are large communities of people who feel left behind. And that is obviously one of the key drivers of modern politics. People who feel locked out, excluded, they feel they've been cheated of something. I mean, this might be in a Rust Belt community in the Midwest, or it might be in a town in the so-called Red Wall in Britain, or it might be in, Eastern France, among Le Pen voters, anywhere in Europe, effectively. And that there is an excellent chance that will become a greater and greater part of the political landscape.
And that is conventionally how we like to think of it, that all the West is in it together, that what happens in America is basically reflected in Europe. But isn't there a possibility, which has seemed to me the implication of those episodes we did with Helen, and that has kind of basically haunted me ever since, and nothing that has happened since we recorded those episodes has persuaded me to change my view on this, that America and Europe may be going on radically divergent parabolas. That if you have cheap energy in the 20th century and into the 21st century, then your economy will grow. If you don't, it will decline. And isn't the possibility that what we're going through at the moment with Putin and, cutting of the Nord Stream and all that kind of stuff, that actually Truss perhaps was justified in mentioning him as early as she did, that Europe stands on the cusp of a process of deindustrialization? I mean, I agree. This was meant to be a cheery and jolly episode with, some light quips about Roman emperors, but
you decided to go in bleak.
Isn't that the joy of a podcast? That as soon as the peerage went up in smoke,
you just became incredibly morbid and gloomy.
Well, I don't know the answer to this.
I think listeners, if they listen back, will notice that's the moment when the tone changes. I'm sure you're right, Tom. I think you probably are right. I think it is a sort of distressing thought that actually, because Europe doesn't have all these cheap energy sources, that Europe is going to find it increasingly difficult. I mean, whether that means a complete divergence of, strategically from the United States or whatever, I don't know. But you're absolutely right that I don't think if you're starting to play a strategy board game set in the year 2022 and then moving onwards, do you choose to play as Western Europe? No, you probably don't, do you?
No. Well, I thought it was kind of symbolic that the parliamentary vote yesterday that I wasn't actually I was off batting for Alfred the Great in a Greatest British
Oh,
Kings
yeah, how did you get on?
debate. I came second behind Elizabeth I. I
Oh,
was doing that
okay.
for Dan
So at least
Snow.
one Liz ends the week triumphant.
Yes. So I started, but as I gather, this was all about a vote on fracking, which has been banned for environmental reasons, and Liz Truss wants to reintroduce.
Yeah, an incredibly toxic policy with much of the Tory party, it has to be said.
Exactly. So it's symbolic, perhaps, of the struggle to get cheap energy that is kind of, I guess, weighing down. Anyway, I'm sorry.
One other thing we haven't mentioned, Tom.
Depressed.
No, it's fine. One other thing we haven't mentioned at all. I'll ask you, because otherwise it's just you interrogating me about increasingly bleak existential questions.
Yes.
Is whether the standard of politicians has declined, as people so often argue that it has. Do you think they've declined in our lifetime?
I always feel that. So I now look back on the days of good King Boris. What wouldn't we give for his moral probity and the stability that he? Yes, but I wonder whether that isn't just the fact that to me the politicians of my childhood seem colossal figures, but I mean that almost literally. I'm a small child watching them on a television; they seem physically bigger. Whereas now they're all, politicians are now younger than me, so I'm less respectful of them.
But the politicians of our childhoods often had come to politics later in life. They had, in our case, a lot of them had served in the Second World War. So somebody like Dennis Healey, Labour Chancellor in the 1970s. A Labour Chancellor who has to go to the International Monetary Fund to beg for a bailout. But he had been a beach master at the Allied landings in Anzio, so basically organising stuff on the beaches. An incredibly dangerous and complicated job.
But that's a different matter, isn't it? That hinterland was Dennis Healey's great word.
Yes,
and
always about
used
himself.
A great deal. So,
Yes.
A kind of interesting backstory isn't necessary to be a good politician. Tony Blair didn't have a particularly interesting backstory, but I think he was a very, very effective prime minister.
Everybody knows you love Tony Blair.
John Major did have an interesting backstory, which he then tried to make as boring as possible.
Well, actually, John Major wrote because John Major, his father had sold garden gnomes. That's great, isn't it?
He's meant to be the model for Major Tom, isn't he? In the Bowie song.
Yeah. As our producer Dom is sending us a message, the only person to run away from the circus to become an accountant. So his father, who had been a music hall performer, John Major later wrote a book about the history of the music hall, and which I reviewed.
It's good, wasn't it?
And the preface, there's a wonderful scene in the preface where he says basically he went to visit his father when his father was dying, and he lived upstairs in some sort of boarding house or something, very kind of sort of shabby post-war London kind of scene
in Brixton.
And John Major goes up to visit him, and he said a succession of very strange, moth-eaten, decrepit people would come up and down the stairs, and these were other ancient musical performers visiting his father. So anyway, yes, that's a tangent. I think they have declined, but I also think the environment in which we expect them to perform has become degraded by social media, by rolling news, by all these kinds of things, which mean that they don't. It's very hard for them to be impressive. Actually, they're expected to to live in this world of sound bites. They're given so little time to write, to think, to read, to take their time, to change their minds.
But one of the things about Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng was that they kind of did, didn't they? They'd written a book.
Their book, Britannia Unchained.
Well, you said you wrote a great essay for Unheard, which UNHERD, about Kwasi Kwarteng being the wrong kind of intelligent. That
he's phenomenally clever.
Yeah,
there is absolutely no doubt about that. Somebody, I said this in the article, and somebody tweeted me, and they said, "Oh, anyone could have, he just was lucky, he was privileged." That's not the case. Kwasi Kwarteng had an absolutely astounding run of achievements clearly from the moment he entered school as a little boy until basically the moment he became an MP. He won endless medals and prizes. He won scholarships. He had a double first from Cambridge. He had a PhD. He wrote books. He was fantastically clever, but he was also clearly lacking in intellectual humility, because somebody with any intellectual humility would not have embarked on such a ludicrously excessively radical package of tax changes, which was clearly going to, everybody had sort of warned him it would explode in your face. And it did.
Capax imperi nisi imperasset. The famous lines written by Tacitus about the Emperor Galba, that everyone would have said he was perfectly suited to be emperor until he actually became emperor. And you could perhaps say the same about
You could say about Quasi-Quarteng. You'd never said
about Liz Truss. No. Quasi-Quarteng, very impressive figure. Liz Truss always seemed faintly ludicrous. Well,
faintly. I mean, I'll be frank, Tom. I will be frank about when Boris fell and there was the talk of. It never occurred to me that she would succeed him, because I just thought she's so obviously a terrible communicator.
Yeah,
and so incredibly unimpressive.
Yeah, and that is so important, isn't it? I mean, she's flat, monotone voice. Nothing she ever says is of any interest.
Yeah, I think it matters enormously. And it's a funny example. This thing about we talking about the activists choosing their leaders. It's a funny example of something that you see again and again in politics, which is that people who are really, really invested in politics are such bad judges of politics. And I often say to people, the less you know about politics, the better able you are to judge it.
But the weird thing was that she was elected almost because she lacked. So Rishi Sunak, who fought the leadership campaign with her, it was his smoothness and his plausibility that party members seem not to have liked.
Yeah, his metropolitanness, his wealth,
but it's his fluency and his smoothness. And so I suppose the implication was that because she had neither fluency nor smoothness, therefore she was somehow more authentic.
Even though she had junked all her principles after leaving university, because she'd previously been a Republican Liberal Democrat.
Well, she'd been a Remainer, and then she became, Anyway, Dominic, she is gone. She is gone.
Yeah, I should give up. I should let her go.
And I feel that we have lingered over the autopsy too long.
Do you?
Yeah, I do a bit, really.
Oh, I think you can just look. Well, this is another peerage attempt, is it?
No, I wouldn't want one from her.
You'd be known. You would be known, because when people would say Lord Holland, and people would be muttering behind your back.
The Truss peer.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm holding out for Penny Mordaunt to knight me on the deck of the Golden Hind or something like that.
Well, she's a naval. She is a naval reservist, and of course, she competed in Splash with Tom Daley. So she would have very much enjoyed our Trafalgar podcasts. And if she becomes PM,
let's hope that.
I hope she listens to them again and does her duty.
It gives us both peerages. Okay,
exactly.
On that note of shameless 18th century would-be cronyism. Thanks very much for listening. Do not forget, if you are not Restless History members, today is Trafalgar Day, and you can mark this most glorious day in British history, Battle of Trafalgar, and wash the taste of the horrors of contemporary British politics out of your mouth by listening to our episode on the actual Battle of Trafalgar, by joining up to the Restless History Club. If not, you'll have to wait till Monday.
Yeah, it's worth saying, Tom, earlier in the podcast, we may have suggested that giving power to activists and members was a bad idea.
No, we're all in favour of
the Restless History Club. We're all for it.
Yeah, we're all for it.
All for it. All right. We'll see you probably next week for the next resignation.
Yes. See you then. Bye.
Bye-bye.